Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today, I want to talk about something that changed the way I learned English. For years, I thought my biggest problem was vocabulary. I thought I needed to learn more words. Then I thought grammar was the problem. After that, I blamed my pronunciation. But eventually, I realized something surprising. None of those things were the real problem. The real problem was happening inside my head. Every time I wanted to speak English, I would first create the sentence in Spanish. Then I would translate it word by word, and only after that would I try to speak. It felt slow. It felt exhausting, and honestly, it made every conversation feel stressful. Have you ever experienced that? You know what you want to say, but before the words come out, your brain starts working overtime. You translate one word, then another, and by the time you're ready to speak, the conversation has already moved on. I remember moments when I had the perfect answer in my mind, but I couldn't say it fast enough. Not because I didn't know English, but because I was trying to translate everything. For a long time, I believed that was normal. I thought every English learner had to do that forever. But one day, I discovered something interesting. The most confident English speakers are not translating every sentence. They are thinking differently, and that simple idea changed everything. Today, we're going to talk about how to stop translating in your head and start thinking in English more naturally. And trust me, the goal is not perfection. The goal is freedom. Freedom to express yourself, freedom to communicate, and freedom to enjoy conversations without feeling trapped inside your own thoughts. So let's talk about it.
That's such a common experience, Mark, and honestly, I think almost every English learner goes through it. The funny thing is that many people believe translating is helping them. They think it's a useful step, but after a while, it becomes a habit that slows everything down. Imagine having a conversation in your native language. You don't stop and think about every single word. You don't build the sentence piece by piece. The ideas simply appear in your mind, and the words follow naturally. That's how communication is supposed to feel. But when we're learning English, many of us create an extra step. First, we think in our native language, then we translate, then we check the grammar, then we worry about pronunciation, and only then do we speak. No wonder we feel exhausted. It's like trying to drive with the parking brake on. You're moving forward, but everything feels harder than it should. I remember doing exactly the same thing. I would prepare entire conversations in my head before speaking. And if someone asked me an unexpected question, I would panic, not because I didn't know English, but because I didn't have enough time to translate. That was the moment I realized something important. Fluent speakers are not necessarily smarter, they are not translating faster. Many of them have simply learned to connect ideas directly to English. And when that starts happening, speaking becomes much more natural. Not perfect, but definitely more natural.
You know, Sarah, what you're saying reminds me of something that happened to me a few years ago. I was talking to someone in English, and the conversation was actually very simple. The other person asked me what I usually did on weekends. That was it. A simple question, and the funny thing is that I knew all the vocabulary. I knew the words for weekend. I knew the words for work. I knew the words for friends. I knew the words for family. But instead of answering naturally, I froze. My brain immediately switched back to Spanish. I started building the sentence there first. Then I tried to translate it. Then I started checking if the grammar was correct. Then I wondered if I was using the right tense. And while all of that was happening inside my head, the other person was still waiting for an answer. It probably only lasted a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. And I remember feeling frustrated because I thought the problem was my English level. I thought I needed more vocabulary, more grammar, more lessons, more practice. But looking back, I don't think that was the real issue. The real issue was that I didn't trust myself. I didn't trust the English I already knew. I was trying to create the perfect sentence before opening my mouth. And that's a dangerous habit because conversations don't wait for perfection. Real conversations move fast. People interrupt each other. They change topics. They ask unexpected questions. And if you're trying to build every sentence word by word, you'll always feel one step behind. I think that's why so many English learners become discouraged. They know much more English than they realize. But because they're translating everything, They never get the chance to use that knowledge naturally, and eventually they start believing things that aren't true. They say things like, "My memory is bad. I'm too old to learn. My pronunciation isn't good enough." Or my favorite one, "I'm not talented with languages." But maybe the problem isn't talent at all. Maybe the problem is that they're carrying an extra weight that native speakers never carry. The weight of translating every thought before speaking. And honestly, once I started realizing that, everything began to change. Not overnight, not magically, but little by little, speaking started to feel lighter, less stressful, less exhausting. And for the first time, I started enjoying conversations instead of fearing them.
Mark, I think you just described something that millions of English learners experience every single day. And the sad part is that many of them don't even realize what's happening. They think the problem is vocabulary or grammar or pronunciation. But often the real problem is something much deeper. It's the fear of making mistakes. Let me ask you something. When you were having that conversation and the other person asked about your weekend, what were you really afraid of? Were you afraid that they wouldn't understand you? Or were you afraid of saying something wrong? Because those are two very different things. I remember a moment when I was learning another language and I had a very similar experience. I was at a small cafe trying to order something simple, nothing complicated, just coffee and a sandwich. I already knew the words. I had studied them many times. I had seen them in books. I had heard them in videos. But when it was my turn to speak, my mind suddenly became crowded. I started questioning everything. Was I using the correct article? Was my pronunciation accurate? Should I use a different word? Was my sentence natural enough? And while I was having this entire debate inside my head, the person behind the counter was simply waiting for my order. Looking back, it's funny, but at the time it felt stressful. And that's when I learned an important lesson. Most people are not analyzing your English as much as you think they are. They're listening for meaning. They're listening for ideas. They're listening for communication. In fact, think about the conversations you have in your native language. Do you stop and analyze every grammar mistake someone makes? Probably not. If a friend tells you a story and makes a small mistake, you don't suddenly stop listening. You focus on the message. And native English speakers do exactly the same thing. That's why I always tell learners something that surprises them. Communication comes first. Perfection comes later. The problem is that many students reverse the order. They spend years waiting for perfect English before they allow themselves to communicate. And because perfection never arrives, they stay silent. They keep studying. They keep preparing. They keep telling themselves that they'll start speaking when they're ready. But what if readiness comes from speaking? What if confidence is not something you gain before you speak? What if confidence is something you build because you speak? That's a completely different way of looking at language learning. And honestly, I think that's where real progress begins. The moment you stop asking yourself, how can I avoid mistakes? And start asking yourself, how can I express this idea? Because ideas are what conversations are made of. Not perfect grammar, not perfect pronunciation, not perfect vocabulary, ideas. And once you understand that, speaking becomes much less intimidating. You stop trying to perform and you start trying to connect. And in my experience, that's when language learning becomes enjoyable for the first time.
You know, Sarah, after realizing that I was translating everything, I started asking myself a simple question. If translating was slowing me down, then what was I supposed to do instead? Because it's one thing to understand the problem. It's another thing to solve it. At first, I thought there was some secret technique that fluent speakers were using. Maybe there was a special exercise. Maybe there was a shortcut. Maybe there was a magic method that I hadn't discovered yet. But what I found was surprisingly simple. The first thing I started doing was naming things around me in English. Not because it was exciting. Honestly, it felt a little silly. I would walk into my kitchen and think table, chair, coffee, window, refrigerator. Nothing complicated, just simple words. Then I started taking small steps forward. Instead of naming objects, I started describing them. The coffee is hot. The window is open. The room is quiet. The weather is nice today. Again, these were not impressive sentences. Nobody would be amazed by them. But something important was happening. For the first time, I was creating ideas directly in English, and that felt different. Then I tried another exercise. When I was driving, walking, or doing something around the house, I would describe what I was doing. I'm making breakfast. I'm going to work. I'm cleaning the kitchen. I'm answering emails. I'm taking a walk. Little by little, my brain started becoming more comfortable with English. Not because I was studying harder, but because I was using English differently. And one day I noticed something interesting. I wasn't translating every sentence anymore. Some thoughts were appearing directly in English. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough for me to notice the difference. And honestly, that moment felt exciting because for years I believed that thinking in English was something advanced learners did. I thought it was reserved for people with perfect grammar and huge vocabularies, but that wasn't true. It started with simple ideas, very simple ideas. The kind of ideas a beginner could use, and that's when I realized that thinking in English isn't really about complexity. It's about consistency. It's about giving your brain permission to use English every day, even in small ways. And the best part is that you don't need a classroom. You don't need a textbook. You don't even need another person. You can start right now, exactly where you are. And once that habit begins to grow, something amazing happens. English stops feeling like a subject you're studying and starts feeling like a language you're actually living.
Mark, I love what you said about consistency because that's exactly what happened to me. The biggest surprise was that thinking in English didn't arrive as a dramatic moment. There was no day when I woke up and suddenly became fluent. There was no magical breakthrough, no fireworks, no special achievement. In fact, the change was so gradual that I almost didn't notice it. But then something happened. One day, I was walking through a grocery store, looking for a few things I needed, and without realizing it, I started talking to myself in English. Not out loud, of course, just in my head. I remember looking at a shelf and thinking, I need coffee. Then a few minutes later, I forgot to buy milk. And later, this line is moving really slowly. The interesting thing wasn't the sentences themselves. They were incredibly simple. The interesting thing was that they appeared directly in English. There was no translation. There was no effort. There was no internal debate. The thoughts just appeared. And when I noticed it, I remember smiling. Because for years I had believed that thinking in English was something far away, something reserved for advanced learners, something I would maybe achieve one day in the distant future. But there I was, standing in a grocery store, thinking simple thoughts in English. And that's when I understood something important. Fluency isn't built during extraordinary moments. It's built during ordinary moments. It's built while you're walking, while you're cooking, while you're driving, while you're waiting in line, while you're living your life. I think that's where many learners get discouraged. They imagine fluency as a destination, a finish line, a point where everything suddenly becomes easy. But that's not how it works. Fluency is usually a collection of small victories. The first time you understand a movie scene without subtitles. The first time you answer a question without translating. The first time you tell a story and realize you weren't thinking about grammar the entire time. The first time you laugh at a joke in English without needing someone to explain it. Those moments seem small, but together they create confidence. And confidence changes everything. Because once you experience those little victories, you stop asking yourself, can I do this? And you start telling yourself, I'm already doing it. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not every day, but you're moving forward. And honestly, that's what learners should celebrate more often. Not perfection, progress, not flawless English, growing confidence. Because every person who speaks English naturally today started exactly where we started, confused, frustrated, translating everything, wondering if they would ever become fluent. The difference is that they kept going, they kept practicing, they kept making mistakes. And little by little, English became part of their lives. Not because they were gifted, not because they were lucky, but because they stayed consistent long enough to see the results. And in my opinion, that's one of the most encouraging things about learning a language. If someone else can do it, so can you.
You know, Sarah, if someone had told me years ago that the key to speaking English more naturally wasn't learning thousands of new words, I probably wouldn't have believed them. Back then, I thought fluency was something far away. Something reserved for people who were smarter than me. People with perfect grammar, people with perfect pronunciation, people who never made mistakes. And because of that belief, I spent a lot of time waiting until I felt ready, waiting until I felt confident, waiting until I thought my English was good enough. But now I realize something important. Confidence didn't come before speaking. Confidence came from speaking. The same thing happened with thinking in English. I thought I needed to reach some advanced level before I could do it. But the truth is that it started with very simple things. A thought, a sentence, a description of something I could see around me. Nothing impressive, nothing complicated. Just small moments repeated over and over again. And looking back, I think that's one of the biggest lessons I've learned as an English learner. Progress often looks boring while it's happening. We imagine improvement as something dramatic, a huge breakthrough, a magical moment. But most of the time, growth is quiet. It's the result of small actions that don't seem important in the moment. It's one more sentence, one more conversation, one more attempt, one more mistake, and eventually, all those little moments start adding up. One day you realize you're understanding more. Another day you realize you're speaking more confidently. And then one day, without even noticing when it happened, English starts feeling more natural. Not perfect, not effortless, but natural. And honestly, I think that's a much better goal than perfection, because perfection is impossible. But progress is available to all of us, no matter where we start. No matter how old we are, no matter how many mistakes we've made. If you're listening to this today and you're still translating everything in your head, don't get discouraged. You're not broken. You're not bad at languages. You're not falling behind. You're simply going through a stage that many learners experience. The important thing is to keep moving forward. Keep exposing yourself to English. Keep thinking simple thoughts. Keep having conversations. And most importantly, give yourself permission to be a learner, because every fluent speaker you admire was once exactly where you are right now, and they reached their goals one small step at a time. So be patient with yourself, trust the process, and keep going.
Mark, I think that's the perfect way to look at it. Learning English is not about becoming a different person. It's not about sounding perfect. And it's definitely not about eliminating every mistake from your speech. It's about becoming more comfortable with the language little by little. One thought at a time, one conversation at a time, one day at a time. And I think that's something many learners need to hear. Because we live in a world that loves quick results, people want fluency in 30 days, confidence in a week, perfect pronunciation by next month. But language learning doesn't work that way. It's much more like planting a tree. At first, it feels like nothing is happening. You study, you listen, you practice. And sometimes it feels like you're making no progress at all. Then one day, you understand a sentence that used to confuse you. A few weeks later, you find yourself speaking more naturally. Months later, you realize you're having conversations that once felt impossible. The growth was happening the entire time. You just couldn't see it day by day. And that's why patience is so important. Not because progress is slow, but because progress is often invisible until you look back. If you're listening to us today, I want you to remember something. You don't need perfect English to start thinking in English. You don't need perfect English to have conversations. You don't need perfect English to communicate. The goal isn't perfection. The goal is connection. Connection with people. Connection with ideas. Connection with a language that can open new opportunities and experiences in your life. And honestly, that's one of the most beautiful things about learning English. Every small effort matters. Every sentence matters. Every conversation matters. Even the awkward ones. Even the uncomfortable ones. Even the ones where you make mistakes. Because those moments are not signs of failure. They're signs that you're learning. So keep going. Keep listening. Keep speaking. Keep thinking in English whenever you can. And most importantly, be kind to yourself during the process. You're probably doing better than you think. Thank you so much for spending this time with us today. We hope this conversation helped you feel a little more confident and a little less afraid of making mistakes. And remember, stop translating every thought. Start living the language. We'll see you in the next episode. Take care, everyone.